Oh,
Hello and welcome to Access Chat. And I'm delighted that our guest today is Ella Decker. Ella and I met recently at the Enabling conference, and then she took pity on me and marched me around DC all afternoon. But she does amazing work in the field of accessibility, inclusive design, and you're working for a portfolio of different organizations at the moment. So do you want to describe yourself and what you do so I don't get it wrong?
yeah, absolutely. I think what's important to highlight is the why behind this work, or that's at least how I like to introduce myself. So I grew up in San Diego. I was a primary caretaker for my aunt who had schizophrenia. She was diagnosed at a young age, but also I myself at a young age really was that kind of conduit between home life and then externally, what happens when we talk about systems that aren't built for people with disabilities, including our social systems. So interactions kind of on a day-to-day basis with other people. And so that's how I dipped my toe into kind of the world of disability and how we think about disability inclusion. And then since then had been fascinated by it. So started taking sign language classes at 14 and then continued on studying at Gallaudet and in DC at American. And for the last 10 years or so have really kind of used that as a foundation for my work with quite a few very different companies, from assistive tech organizations, development finance institutions, as well as really large name brands that are just also dipping their toe into the disability and accessibility space. And so helping them think about strategy, think about authentic representation and messaging, as well as the holistic picture. I think about accessibility or disability inclusion needing to be done from the inside out. So not performative work, but really making sure you're aligning your decks before you're going out to market and talking about inclusive products or inclusive employment or accessible technology. So yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
It's a real pleasure to have you here, and I love the systems thinking approach to organizational accessibility and inclusion. I do think that there is a real challenge and a balance between getting all of your ducks in a row and sorting out all of your processes, which is a huge undertaking, and understanding when to communicate. So it's not about sort of performative allyship or A11Y-ship, but if we don't talk about it, we also don't make people aware. So it's that delicate balance, I think, between really having something tangible and starting to get it into the mindsets and the consciousness of people. So I really appreciate the approach that you're taking to bringing stakeholders on board. And I think Deborah also had a question.
I did. Thank you so much, Neil, for giving me the floor. I've known about Ella's work for a long time, and I think one thing that I like about your work, Ella, is that you're not looking at it from just the compliance lens, I guess is one easy way to say it. Because, we know how to make things accessible now. We know how to make things accessible. It's just, do we really have the will to make sure that all humans can participate? And I know from your work that you also are really looking at it from almost a human-centric design too, which is silly. You would think everyone's looking at it that way, but often they're not, especially here in the United States. And so that's something that always attracted me to your work, because it just felt very authentic. And so I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on the need for us to be even more authentic and really understand, why are we even doing this? What do we really, after it's all said and done, what are we trying to really accomplish here? And I just thought it would be because I know about your work. And so I would just like for you to tell the audience, where should we be going?
Yeah, I think about this work kind of flipped on its head in a way that a McKinsey or an EY would think about systems design thinking, which is change management. So getting a really large organization, let's say, I don't know, 100 to 200,000 people to change their mindset doesn't happen overnight. And it is not just about the systems, but it's ultimately about the culture. So if people are at a base level of understanding why disability inclusion or authentic representation or systems design thinking that's inclusive of accessibility, they're just at the starting point, then it's going to take a really long time to change the culture, which ultimately will inform the system. So I think when we talk about this work, it's not just thinking human-centered design. How does this influence one person, one customer, one employee? It's thinking about, well, how is that manager or how is that team set up for success if a neurodivergent employee were to join this workforce tomorrow? And I think what's often a challenge as well is this work is siloed in the sense of, okay, maybe it's living in compliance or an accessibility center of excellence, but then ultimately thinking about how to influence that change over time is a challenge. And I like to think of this kind of work or that person as an octopus. So they're reaching their hand tentacles in several different parts of an organization. But ultimately, that means that that person is set up from success from beginning to end, meaning they've got the authority, the trust, and the responsibility to do that as an individual contributor rather than, okay, we're stuck in this island. We're going to try to wave our hands and get people to come here. I think it is a little bit of both. So always thinking about your consumer, your customer, your employee as that center for change. But ultimately, in order to be influencing change around an organization, you've got to be able to hop in different puddles and somewhat be that jack of all trades.
I love the octopus analogy. And I like to think I have my tentacles everywhere in an organization. But it is true, it's a transversal topic. You can't address the culture without addressing it across multiple different levels and parts of an organization. And when we start going multinational as well, you've got additional cultural things to take into account and language and all of the rest of it. So large organizations are complex anyway, but when you start going across borders, it becomes more complex. And then you have like multiple different speeds and multiple different levels of maturity and so on. So you might well have parts of an organization that are quite mature, quite culturally engaged and everything else, and other parts which are just starting out. So you said you're working with organizations that are just starting out. Are there any things that you see in common with those organizations, or are there significant differences, because culturally organizations can be quite different?
Yeah, I am currently, great question, because I think just actually off the top is recognizing that language is really different country to country. And I know here in the US, we like to think everything we're doing, above the meridian line is the best in class. But I think we have a lot to learn from our colleagues from all over the world. So recognizing the way in which language is used is really one of those key points. And ultimately, how disability is identified is another one. I think one of the interesting kind of synthesized feedback I've received is people still are really uncomfortable within their own disabilities in the global South, right? And I've done a lot of work internationally to recognize that and look kind of across the world. And that is my dog barking. Across the world.
Joining us. Hello.
Yeah, that's Mark. Big chocolate lab. But I think really it's thinking about how do we create that culture of inclusion to inform the systems, but ultimately get everybody on the same page. So that really starts with somebody like me at an organization that, let's say, does have multiple different offices across the world to set and lay the foundation, but ultimately get the CEO to buy in, right? Or get the president or the executive director to lay that foundation and champion it. There's quite a few studies out recently, and we'll call out our friends at BCG who've done that work with 20,000 different organizations to say, yeah, our leadership thinks we're doing a great job, but the employees actually don't feel comfortable identifying, don't feel comfortable coming forward, for fear of retribution, for fear of some kind of being labeled as an outcast. And so there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done there, again, through that cultural model shift, to really think about how to set the groundwork and how to set the foundation so that people feel comfortable at work and doing their jobs. And that's in every office. So at an expansive lens, it's going to require quite a bit of gap analysis to be able to determine what steps need to be taken to really make people feel included and comfortable.
Can I come in real quick and say, Ella, that I know that there was some informal research done where we talked to a lot of CEOs. And as they did this, 3 out of 4 of the CEOs actually identified as being part of our community, but did not feel comfortable themselves coming out. So I know at Billion Strong, we're very focused on identity acceleration for our community. And so I love how you're talking about it too. And we also see people like some real high level leaders talking about it from these frames as well. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the points that you just made. Sorry to take the mic before you, Neil. I know I'm tearing you up.
No, it's a very interesting and challenging topic, and like you were saying, Deborah, many CEOs are not comfortable, and when CEOs are not comfortable, it means that HR is going to avoid the conversation. It means HR is not going to create the space where employees are going to be able to feel comfortable in talking about it, and they prefer even to avoid talking about accessibility or disability at the workplace, or even talking about their needs. But sometimes a big mistake that I see entities doing is not just in this case, is also when they go into big change management transformation, is when they don't listen to employees first.
Mm-hmm.
When they don't have the ability to reach out. Sometimes they do this centrally. They listen to the employees in Seattle, but they don't listen to anybody else. But when they're able to listen to everyone around the world, they're able to go into local communities at work and able to understand the feelings and the emotions of the employees. They are in a better situation in them to start to realize how can really do things. But when they come from top down, sometimes there's a clash between, because you are being told not to talk about this, you are afraid, and suddenly you are being asked, and between you don't really know, okay, I'm going to talk about my disability, but I'm going to talk with someone in the United States or someone in Europe, but I'm not sure if my Brazilian office is going to be that happy if I talk about it. So I think that we face a number of challenges, and something that we have been talking recently, and between myself, Neil and Deborah, is why sometimes CEOs are so silent in talking about this. We very rarely see a CEO talking about disability at the conference, at an event. They might talk about diversity in the space of gender diversity or ethnic diversity, but we very rarely see them comfortable on stage talking about disability.
So it's a great response, because I think this isn't something unique to just our community. It happens across communities, right? Which is, well, for the US, for example, it took a lot of really harmful and polarizing politics in order for the CEO to reach out to the Black community in the US and say something. And so that kind of recognition does go for miles. But again, it is not unique to this community. To your point about getting buy-in and getting collaboration and getting feedback from every level of an organization, I've seen this with clients who, have had CEOs that have not necessarily been forthcoming with addressing the disability community, and 400 members of an ERG, an employee resource group, showed up, knocked on the door and said, "We're here and we'd like to talk." So there is power in numbers. And I think that is one of the key points of this strategic work, is to identify who your tiger team is, who's the day-to-day operators, who's going to go out and be that kind of individual contributor across those 8 different tentacles. But ultimately, who's going to be the lever of change, and what kind of organization is it within your own organization or your own company, your own nonprofit, that's going to shift a needle and shift a perception. It really took 400 people in an entire ERG community from across the globe to come in and make a shift, and to make that really recognizable to the CEO. I think another really good example of a potential strategy to use in this equation is something called an IDI, or an in-depth interview, and making sure that you're cultivating all of those interviews to inform a strategy, or to inform an accessibility policy, to inform, International Day of Persons with Disabilities launch, or whatever it might be. But those are really important tools to take in as you're developing anything new for a community that, again, is really polarized, right? We think about disability at all different parts of the spectrum, but coming together and finding a North Star for what consensus is still a really big challenge that at least I'm seeing every day within the groups and people I'm working with.
Ella, I know that Neil wants to come in, but I just want to make one quick comment just to make sure nobody gets confused. One thing I do think that is dangerous, if there is only one person at the company that's driving this, and I know you're not saying that, I just want to make sure the audience doesn't think that's what you're saying. Because what we see is sometimes these, and Neil's a superhero. Atos is so lucky to have Neil and his team. But the reality is, if Neil left and it hadn't been really built in the process, you're going to lose everything that you gained, corporation, brand. So I just wanted to make that quick comment, and I know Neil also wants to come in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully now we've got the foundations and we're above ground. And so should I get run over by a bus tomorrow, it wouldn't all disintegrate. But I wanted to kind of follow up on the stuff about consultation and the whole process of sort of having that conversation with employees, because I think that you mentioned BCG in their survey, which then informed the report that Hillary published, which I quote all the time around self-ID and so on. But I think that quite often when organizations implement change programs, they frame the questions in a way so that they get the answers that they want to hear. And so the way that we've asked the questions has to be open enough that we actually get answers that are meaningful. Because I remember, one particular survey, and it was saying, I agree that, I'm not discriminated against on grounds of race, gender, disability, or whatever. And they were asking various different things. And, people were celebrating that 85% of people with disabilities, of the organization felt that they weren't discriminated on grounds of disability. And then I was like, well, that probably means that about 100% of your disabled staff do feel that, because the way that the data was presented. So I think that there's that too, because if we really truly want to listen, we've got to ask questions that elicit really good, meaningful answers. So I think that's a challenge to management around the globe to be brave enough to ask some open questions.
And have the integrity to write them in a way that isn't a leading question like a lawyer, right? And I think that's the kind of beauty of IDIs, which is they're open-ended. They're a conversation like this. And when I think you can open it up as a conversation, you probably are going to get a lot more than you bargained for. But that's it's a good thing to know, right? You're spotting where the boat has holes so that you can plug them and you can make them better and you can sail along a lot faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Antonio, I know you've got a question.
No, another element I think is important to bring to the discussion is when organizations start to get excited about the topic. Some organizations don't really have the support mechanisms for employees to do their jobs. And some of them are excited about, the conversation is happening. But in many situations, they are still the ones carrying the costs of tools and some of the things that they need to work. So how we make sure that this conversation also goes in pair with conversations about accommodations?
It's a great question and a tough one because I don't work in HR and accommodations. It seems, at least again in the US, it seems like this never-ending challenge of figuring out, and this isn't my personal belief, but these teams that I'm reading about all the time on online are talking about how some things or certain things aren't an accommodation, right? And it's really interesting how we've developed this form of amnesia after the pandemic. I mean, we were all able to do what we're doing right now from home, and then apparently working from home is no longer an accommodation, right? So it's a really interesting conversation to have, and especially looking towards the, let's say, faux pas that the executive from Zoom said, hey, we need to go back to the office. I mean, talk about a moment where I don't know if that necessarily matches your brand story, but okay. So I think it's actually really pairing what your story is and your core foundations and your core values as a company to some of those accommodations requests. Hey, your company, this organization says the core value is creating an equitable work environment so that everybody has the opportunity to participate while they're here at work. Well, that needs to follow up and in line with what your HR and accommodations policy is. I think the really great phrase I've heard for accommodations is calling it an access requirement. So it's not an accommodation. This isn't something we're providing you. It's actually a requirement for me to be able to show up in an equitable way. So I really like that kind of language, which is forcing accountability on a company or an organization or an HR team, rather than saying this is something we're gifting you. A couple of organizations that I think have done it really correctly for, again, specific populations, specific disability communities. Amazon, I know, has gotten a lot of slack recently on some of their work, but what they've done in the sense of hiring interpreters for every single deaf employee is really phenomenal, because it's, a nominal lift to hire that employee, but it means a world of difference for equitable and economic opportunity for deaf people who want to work at Amazon that have never thought that that was a possibility. And so some of that, I think, ultimately does weave into these brand stories that can make a difference, right? People can learn, other organizations can learn from those kinds of companies and say, this is something we want to do. So the next time an ERG of 300, 400 people show up at the CEO's doorstep, they can point to some of these case studies and say, look, this is what your competitors are doing. Doesn't this make you feel a little like you need to be on the next cusp or the next iteration of this work because your competitors are doing it? And so I think, again, it's identifying those levers of change that's going to shift a needle if you don't yourself hold the ring, right, or the power mechanism. So I think it's being able to use the right kinds of communications tools to ultimately shift a perception.
I think Deborah was saying good point. Deborah,
I'm sorry, I'm muted, but yeah, I love every. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree because if a CEO, just using one person once again, if a CEO or a leader, I'd rather say a leader, really wants to lead in these intense, troubled times, just be authentic, come out, help humans do better, help us. There's so many things that we could do to, take all this wonderful technology we have at our hands now to really experience something amazing, including protecting our planet. So I love everything you're saying. And I love how your work has shifted as well since last time I was looking at what you were doing. So, because I believe this is the way forward, working together, holding each other accountable, and really celebrating who we are. So I just thank you, Neil, for letting me come in. I really appreciate your words.
Yeah, pleasure. So, I mean, when we talk about what we want to do, so we don't actually talk about accommodation, certainly not in the UK. It's very US term. We talk about workplace adjustments, and we don't actually talk about necessarily disability. And our program talks about enabling everyone to contribute their best. And so it's implicit, but also we have multiple different strands to our work. So yes, we need to provide accommodations, but that's about being an effective organization. If we don't do that, then people can't work effectively, whether that be working from home or having the software that they need to do their jobs, or even just simple things like a comfortable chair or a decent set of headphones, because those can be the difference between being able and empowered to do your job and struggling and not coping and falling behind. So I think that when we talk about it in terms of organizational effectiveness and enablement and so on, people buy in. Not all people. We still get the idea of chair envy. We still get the idea that well, if we make it available, maybe they'll take it. Well, maybe if we make it available, they'll be more effective. So I think that there's still some resistance to a very open approach to this within organizations, and that is driven from a fear of spending money rather than a fear of, there's a sort of a famine mentality when it comes to sort of disability inclusion. And actually, when you take a mentality of actually this is an investment and you'll get a really good return on investment, and don't to quote Jenny Flurry at Enabling, she was saying, "Don't ask me for the ROI." I think there is a good ROI, and I think that what we want is for that not to be BS, because there's an awful lot of BS figures out there, which is what Jenny was alluding to. But there are clear metrics, and I think that as reporting gets better, and corporate reporting is a really big thing, then we're going to get much better at showing the ROI of doing some of this stuff.
And on corporate reporting, I think some of the most impactful work that I've been able to touch in the last couple of months and years is around ESG and how we are weaving that narrative of disability inclusion and accessibility, for that matter, into our ESG corporate reporting structures and our principles and our performance standards. Those are things that have enormous potential. But I think beyond just that, it's how do we get out of our own vacuum here, right?
Yeah.
We are a really tight and small community, but we need to bring in others, and we need to also train other people in other parts of an organization to understand it, maybe self-identify, and then also take the baton forward and carry it. One of my new favorite quotes is from the Bumble CEO, who recently stepped down and passed over the baton. And she said something to the effect of, "This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, but it's also a relay race. And I am passing the baton to the next woman in charge." And so I think we also can take a lesson from that and see how we can continue to pass on batons to other members of our community, to younger people, to more diverse audiences that have very intersectional experiences. Because often when I'm at these conferences or attending different meetings around disability inclusion, we are not seeing a diverse enough set of people up on stage and talking about their work, which ultimately probably means there aren't enough diverse people within the disability community having these conversations or invited to have these conversations. And so if that is a goal of mine in the next couple of months, it is bringing people in and bringing them up that have been marginalized from this community and from these conversations.
That's just absolutely the right thing to do. Thank you so much for a great conversation. Clearly, there's loads more topics. I mean, you just in the last couple of minutes, you opened up probably another 2 podcasts worth of stuff there. So I think we'll definitely want to have you back on. But I also need to thank MyClearText and Amazon for keeping us on air, keeping us captioned and accessible. So thank you, Ella. It's been a joy talking with you, and we look forward to continuing the discussion on social media.
Sounds good. Thank you all for having me. Have a good weekend.